The signal did not come with fire or thunder. It came quietly, the way the most dangerous things often do. It slipped through every frequency at once: radio, satellite, military band, civilian broadcast. It broke into television screens during the middle of news segments. It appeared on phones that were switched off. It came in every human language, spoken perfectly, without accent, without pause. And it said the same thing everywhere, at the same moment, to every person on Earth. You have 72 hours to surrender. Resistance will result in the destruction of your world. This is not a negotiation. This is a courtesy. Then it stopped. For about 4 seconds, the entire planet was silent. Then it was not. The panic came fast. Markets crashed within minutes. Governments scrambled. Military channels lit up so quickly that some of them went down under the load. Millions of people stepped outside and looked at the sky, as though they could see something up there, as though the sky would tell them what to do next. What the sky showed them was nothing unusual. Blue. Clouds. The ordinary afternoon light of a world that had not yet changed. But change was already in motion. The Dravery fleet was sitting at the outer edge of the solar system, just beyond Neptune, and every telescope on Earth that could point in that direction found them. 12 warships. Each one was roughly the size of a small moon. They were not moving. They were simply there, the way a wall is there, patient, solid, and completely uninterested in what you think about it. The Dravery had been expanding for 600 years. They had absorbed 47 civilizations. Not one of those civilizations had fought back. Some had tried to negotiate. Some had begged. Most had simply agreed immediately, because looking at a Dravery war fleet and deciding to resist it was, by any reasonable measure, not something a sane species would do. The Dravery had stopped expecting resistance a long time ago. They sent the ultimatum as a formality, a courtesy, as they said. They would wait the 72 hours because that was the procedure, and then the humans would transmit a formal signal of surrender, and the fleet would move into orbit, and that would be that. Fleet Commander Drath watched his instruments from the command deck of his flagship and found the whole process boring. He had done this 47 times. There was nothing to learn from it anymore. He told his second officer to alert him when the surrender signal came through, and he went to rest. On Earth, nobody was resting. The United Earth Council met within 3 hours of the signal. Every nation that had a seat sent its representative. Some of them came by emergency transport, some by screen. The chamber in Brussels was so full that people were standing along the walls. Translators worked in real time. Nobody needed them. They had all heard the message in their own language, but old habits hold in a crisis. The debate lasted 11 hours. It was not the debate that people would have expected. There was no one standing up to argue for surrender because surrender seemed reasonable. There were some who argued for it because they were afraid, and fear is a legitimate reason, and most people in that room understood it. But even the ones who argued most quietly for compliance were not doing so because they thought it was right. They were doing so because they thought it was the only option. And then Secretary General Petra Wolf stood up. She was not a tall woman. She had gray in her hair and a voice that had spent 30 years in rooms like this one, talking people down from edges. She did not shout. She did not wave her hands. She simply stood at the center of the chamber and looked around at all of them. She said that she had spent her whole career negotiating. She said that in every real negotiation, both sides had to be willing to walk away. She said that surrender was not a negotiation, it was the end of one. She said that the moment humanity gave up its sovereignty, it would never get it back. Not from a species that had done this 47 times and had never once returned what it took. She said that they had not survived everything they had survived. The wars, the plagues, the slow disasters of their own making, to hand their world to strangers in the dark. Then she sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then they voted. It was not unanimous, nothing with that many people ever is. But it was close. Close enough. The United Earth Council voted to refuse the Dravery ultimatum. The response they transmitted back was not a long speech. It was not a declaration or a list of demands. It was 7 words, chosen by a committee of linguists and diplomats and one retired soldier who had been standing in the back of the room and said it quietly under his breath first, and then said it again when people turned to look at him. Come and take it if you dare. The signal went out on every frequency. It reached the Dravery fleet in just over 4 hours at the speed of light. Drath was woken by his second officer. He read the message twice. He checked that the translation was correct. He sat very still for a moment, and then he asked how many ships Earth had sent in response to the ultimatum. His officer told him that sensors had detected one ship departing Earth's orbit. One, a mid-sized vessel, not a warship by design. It was heading directly toward the fleet. Drath looked at the data for a long time. He did not feel fear. He did not feel anger. He felt something much stranger, which was a kind of uncertainty he had not experienced in decades. Because in 47 encounters, not one civilization had ever sent a ship. He sent an alert to Collective High Command. Then he waited, and for the first time in a very long time, he was not bored. 12,000 kilometers from Earth, the INS Resolute moved through the dark at full burn, and nobody on board was under any illusion about what they were sailing toward. The Resolute had been built for exploration. That was the honest truth of it. The ship had wide cargo bays designed for geological samples, lab spaces meant for studying alien atmospheres, and communication arrays built for long-distance broadcasting rather than combat. It had the bones of a vessel that was supposed to go places and learn things, not fight. But humanity had been given 72 hours, and humans are very creative when they have 72 hours and nowhere else to go. Admiral Ren Okafor had not slept since the signal came through. Not because he was afraid, or not only because of that, but because there had simply been too much to do, and sleep felt like something that belonged to a version of him that still had the luxury of it. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with the careful, deliberate movements of someone who had learned to conserve energy over long missions. He had spent his career in deep space, mapping gas giants and cataloging debris fields. He had never fired a weapon at anything alive. He stood at the rear observation window and watched Earth shrink behind them. He had not looked at it this way in years. From here, it was just a sphere, blue and white and small. Very small. He stayed there for a while, looking at it, and then he turned back to the ship. Chief Engineer Bayo Ferris found him in the corridor outside the engine bay. She was short, quick-eyed, and had grease on her left forearm that she had clearly stopped trying to wipe away. She told him the weapons were ready. She used the word weapons because that was what they were now, but she said it the way a person says a word they are still getting used to. The mining lasers had been reconfigured. 2 of the deep-bore arrays were now focused beam emitters. She had worked with the physics team to boost their output by about 30% over standard. In theory, they could cut through the hull of a Dravery warship, slowly, at close range, after sustained contact. Okafor asked what the margins looked like. She said they were what they were. He understood that answer completely. The crew of the Resolute was 1,200 people. They had not been drafted. Every single one of them had been given the same simple choice by the same short message sent to every active officer and crew member in Earth's deep space program. The ship was going, the mission was this, and if they wanted to come, they could come. Nobody was ordered. Nobody was forced. 1,197 people showed up. The remaining 3 had families with very young children, and Okafor had quietly, personally, told all 3 of them to stay. They had argued. He had not budged. Lieutenant Dov Merrick was 26 years old and had grown up in a city that knew what it meant to live under the threat of something larger than itself. He was the ship's primary weapons officer, which was a job title that had not existed on the Resolute 48 hours ago. He sat at his new station and ran the targeting systems through their calibrations for the 4th time and told himself that the numbers were good because they were, and that was the whole thought, and he moved on to the next check. Commander Sarai Ibanez stood near the back of the bridge and watched the crew work. She was Okafor's first officer, and her job in this moment was not to do any one specific thing, but to see everything. She saw a crew that was afraid and focused and doing their jobs with a kind of careful intensity that she had never seen on any other mission. She saw people who had made a decision and were living inside it. She thought that was probably the best thing a crew could be. Dr. Anika Solberg, the ship's xenolinguist, brought the intercepted Dravery transmissions to the bridge and began translating them in real time. The Dravery had not bothered to encrypt their internal communications. Why would they? No civilization had ever been close enough to intercept them before. The messages going back and forth between the fleet and the collective home world were not alarmed. They were not urgent. They were, if anything, mildly curious. A few of them were amused. The Dravery word for what the Resolute was doing, Anika told the bridge crew, translated most closely as a very small thing making noise. She paused and added that the connotation was affectionate rather than hostile, like something you might say about a child who was pretending to be dangerous. Nobody on the bridge laughed, but a few people straightened in their seats. Okafor sat in his chair and thought. The fleet was 12 ships. The Resolute was one, and it had been built for mapping asteroid fields. The math was not subtle. He knew the math. He had known the math when he accepted the orders, and the math had not stopped him, because some things are not about math. He opened the ship wide channel. He did not give a long speech. He was not that kind of commander, and this was not that kind of moment. He said that they all knew where they were going and why. He said that they had been given 72 hours to surrender, and they had answered. He said the answer was still in transit, traveling at the speed of light, and they were the answer. All of them together, on one ship, in the dark. He closed the channel. Sarai came to stand beside him. She looked at the instruments, at the vast and empty black ahead of them. She said, quietly, that she hoped the Dravery understood what they had done. Okafor looked at her. She said, inviting a species like this to make a decision like this. He almost smiled. He turned back to the dark and let the Resolute carry them forward. There is a particular kind of silence that exists at the edge of something very large. Not the silence of empty space, which is simply absence. This was the silence of restraint, of power sitting still because it had not yet decided to move. The Resolute crossed into the Dravery exclusion zone at 0340 ship time, moving at reduced speed, running full active sensors, with every system on the ship performing exactly the function it was meant to perform. The crew had been awake for a long time. Nobody was sleeping now. The Dravery fleet appeared on the display screens, and for a long moment nobody on the bridge said anything. 12 warships. The smallest of them was 4 times the length of the Resolute. The largest, the flagship, was in a class by itself. It sat at the center of the formation like a mountain that had decided to leave the ground. Its hull was dark and segmented, layered in interlocking plates the color of old iron, and it showed no lights at all. It did not need to announce itself. Dov Merrick looked at the tactical display and did the geometry automatically, the way his training had taught him to, and then he stopped himself from saying out loud what the geometry showed. Okafor looked at the formation for about 10 seconds. Then he told the communications officer to open a channel to the Dravery flagship. The channel opened. For a moment, there was only static and the faint harmonic hiss of Dravery frequency bands. Then Drath's voice came through. Dr. Anika Solberg translated in real time, her voice low and steady beside Okafor's ear. The fleet commander's opening was businesslike. He said he was prepared to accept the formal terms of surrender and outline the process. He spoke the way a person speaks who has done the same task 47 times, with the mild, polished efficiency of something that has become ordinary. He finished and waited. Okafor let the silence sit for 3 full seconds. Not because he was uncertain, because he wanted the silence to mean something. Then he said, "Fleet Commander, you are in our solar system without invitation and without permission. I am Admiral Ren Okafor of the INS Resolute, representing the United Earth Council. I am here to escort you out." 11 seconds passed. In the later records, those 11 seconds would become the most studied silence in Dravery diplomatic history, analyzed, annotated, written about at length by both human and alien historians. 11 seconds during which Fleet Commander Drath, a being who had overseen the surrender of 47 civilizations and had not once in 600 years of collective expansion heard anything other than yes, processed what he had just been told. When he spoke again, there was something different in his voice. Still controlled, still calm, but different. He asked if the human commander understood the composition of the fleet he was speaking to. Okafor said that he did. Drath asked if the human commander understood the previous record of civilizations that had refused the collective's ultimatum. Okafor said there was no previous record, because no civilization had refused. He said that was fine. He said they were making one now. Another pause, shorter this time. Drath said that he would give the human ship 12 hours to withdraw before he considered the gesture of resistance officially noted and moved to the next phase of the procedure. Okafor thanked him. Then he said, clearly, that he was giving the Dravery fleet 12 hours to withdraw from human space. He said the offer was genuine and it was the only one that would be made. He closed the channel. Sarai looked at him from across the bridge. She did not say anything. Neither did anyone else. The silence on the Resolute was very different from the silence on the Dravery flagship. It was the silence of a crew that had just heard their commanding officer say something that could not be unsaid, and who had decided, each of them privately and completely, that they agreed with it. While the two commanders had been talking, Anika had not been idle. She had been feeding intercepted Dravery internal communications to a secondary analysis, comparing the fleet's sensor emissions against the technical profiles in Earth's files on known alien technology, files that were thin, because humanity had only been watching the Dravery from a distance. But thin was not nothing. She found it in the emission patterns. The 12 warships were not operating their targeting systems independently. They were networked, a shared system, a single firing grid coordinated through a relay node on the third ship from the left of the formation. It was elegant engineering. It meant the fleet could coordinate fire with extraordinary precision. But it also meant that the network had a single point that, if disrupted, would leave every ship on the grid targeting blind simultaneously. She brought it to Bayo first. Bayo looked at the data for about 90 seconds, asked two very precise technical questions, and then went quiet in the particular way she went quiet when she was calculating something that mattered. Then she brought it to Okafor. He read the analysis. He looked at the fleet on his screen. He asked Bayo what disrupting the node would require. She said it would require the Resolute to get to a specific range, hold position for approximately 40 seconds while the disruption pulse charged, and fire. She said 40 seconds was a long time to hold position while a war fleet was paying attention to you. She said it with the honesty of someone who does not see the point of softening a fact. He nodded. He told her to have it ready, but not to fire without his order. Then he looked at the 12-hour clock that had just begun, and he thought about the Dravery, who had done this 47 times and had never once had to consider what would happen if the answer was no. He thought they were about to find out. The 12 hours ran out at 0540 ship time. Nobody on the Resolute had slept. Some people had eaten. Most had not. The crew sat at their stations in the particular kind of quiet that comes not from peace but from the completion of a decision, when there is nothing left to debate and what remains is only the doing of the thing. Drath's flagship sent no further communications when the clock expired. What it sent instead was a single focused pulse of directed energy, not at the Resolute's hull, but across its bow. A warning shot, by Dravery convention. A gesture that said, last chance, one more opportunity, no shame in stepping back. Okafor watched the pulse cross the display screen and leave a blue-white streak across the void. He told Dov to fire. The Resolute's modified mining lasers were not elegant weapons. They were powerful industrial tools that had been pointed in a new direction. They did not look impressive on the display. Just two steady beams of concentrated light reaching out across the gap between ships. But they hit the relay node on the third warship with precision, because Anika had given Bayo the exact coordinates, and Bayo had not missed. 440 seconds, the longest 40 seconds most of the crew would ever experience. The Resolute held position and kept firing. Then the disruption pulse discharged. Every Dravery warship in the formation went dark on the targeting grid simultaneously. Their weapon systems did not go offline. They still worked, but the network that allowed them to coordinate fire across 12 ships collapsed entirely. For a fleet designed around coordinated strikes, it was like suddenly trying to fight with your eyes closed. Drath's response was immediate and furious. He switched to independent targeting and ordered the 3 closest ships to open fire. What followed was not a battle in the way that battles are sometimes described. It was not organized or clean or cinematic. It was loud and fast and very dangerous, and it went badly in several directions at once. The first Dravery salvo hit the Resolute on its port side and took out a full section of the ship. The explosion was contained by emergency bulkheads. The crew in that section had been evacuated to secondary positions 20 minutes earlier because Sarai had made that call quietly and without being asked, because she was good at her job. But the section was gone. The structural readout showed a clean red block where there had been a corridor and 3 labs and a crew lounge. 31 people had been stationed in the adjacent spaces. They did not all make it to the secondary positions in time. Okafor received the casualty report while he was directing the counterstrike. He acknowledged it. He did not stop. Bayo worked from inside a partially collapsed secondary engineering bay with a broken rib, which she discovered only later when the pain became too consistent to ignore. Her team kept the core systems functional. The weapons kept firing. Dov targeted the closest warship, one of the three that had opened fire, with everything the Resolute had. He held the beams on a single point of the hull, rotating targeting to chase the weakest thermal signature, and he did not look away from his screen. And after 3 minutes and 40 seconds of sustained fire, the hull of that warship breached. The Dravery ship did not explode dramatically. It vented catastrophically from the breach, and then its power systems failed in sequence, and it went dark and began to drift. But it was out of the fight, and it was the first Dravery warship that had ever been put out of a fight in 600 years of collective expansion. Nobody on the Resolute cheered. They did not have room in them for that yet. The battle continued for another 22 minutes. 2 more Dravery ships took significant damage from sustained fire, though they did not go dark. The Resolute took 3 more hits. One of them knocked out the secondary navigation array. One of them caused a fire in the lower cargo bay that Sarai's damage control teams fought for 11 minutes before containing it. Then Drath did something that had no precedent in collective history. He ordered the fleet to pull back. Not retreat. He would not use that word, and the collective records would never use it either. He called it a tactical repositioning. He called it a recalibration of approach. What it was, functionally, was the Dravery fleet moving away from a single human ship, because the single human ship had destroyed one of its own and damaged 2 more and showed no sign at all of stopping. His second officer told him that the targeting network could be restored in approximately 4 hours. Drath said to begin the restoration. Then he looked at the sensor data showing the Resolute, damaged, venting trace atmosphere from 3 hull wounds, still holding its position in the space the fleet had just vacated. And he felt something that took him a long time to name. It was not respect. The collective did not have a concept exactly like respect between enemies. It was something closer to a recalibration of his own assumptions, a recognition that the model he had been using for 600 years had a variable in it that he had never accounted for. On the Resolute, Okafor sat in his chair and looked at the damage reports. The ship was wounded. His crew was wounded. 31 people were not coming home, and more were in the medical bay, and the ship smelled of burned insulation and the strange flat odor of emergency sealant. He looked at the space where the Dravery fleet had been. Sarai came to stand beside him. She said, simply, that they were still there. The ship, the crew, still in one piece, more or less, still in position. He looked at her. She said, they moved. We didn't. He looked back at the empty space where 12 warships had been and let that sit for a moment. Then he told the crew to begin damage assessment and prioritize repairs. There was work to do, and they were still the people who had to do it. It takes time for light to cross the distances between stars. The battle between the Resolute and the Dravery fleet happened at the edge of the solar system, and the record of it, the electromagnetic scatter, the energy signatures, the raw data of a warship engaging a fleet and making the fleet move, spread outward in all directions at the speed of light, quiet and unstoppable, the way a stone dropped in water sends its rings to the very edge of the pond. The Dravery collective received the full report from Drath before the light reached anyone else. High Command met in closed session. The transcript of that meeting was sealed. What happened after the meeting was not. 3 days after the engagement, a Dravery broadcast went out to all species currently under collective jurisdiction, 47 civilizations, absorbed over 600 years, each one cataloged and managed, and kept in a state of careful, low-cost compliance. The broadcast was intended to explain that the human incident was a minor complication, being handled, not a cause for concern. It had precisely the opposite effect. Because the broadcast contained, without fully realizing it, the one piece of information that all 47 of those civilizations had been waiting for without knowing they were waiting for it. It contained the acknowledgement, buried in formal collective language but unmistakable to anyone paying attention, that a target species had engaged the fleet, destroyed 1 warship, damaged 2 others, and caused the fleet to reposition. The fleet had moved. A Dravery War fleet, which had never once moved away from anything, had moved away from 1 human ship. The first species to contact Earth was the Titian. They were a tall, pale, feathered people who had been absorbed by the collective 41 years earlier. And in 41 years they had been very quiet and very careful and very compliant, because that was the only way to keep their world intact. Their ambassador, a woman named Riva, sent a signal in 17 different frequencies simultaneously to make absolutely sure it got through. The message was short. It had been composed and recomposed and debated among Titian leadership for 2 full days before they agreed on the final wording. It said, "You are not alone. We have been waiting." When Anika translated it on the bridge of the still damaged Resolute, she had to read it twice to make sure she had it right. Then she sat very still for a moment. Then she brought it to Okafor. He read it. He did not say anything immediately. He took the message back to his chair and sat with it for a while, turning it over in his mind the way you turn over something that changes the shape of the room you thought you were standing in. On Earth, Petra Wolf received the same message 4 hours later, slightly delayed by the route it had taken. She was in a situation room, surrounded by advisors and analysts, when it came through. She read it. Then she asked everyone except her 3 most senior staff to leave the room. Then she read it again. She said, to nobody in particular, that they had gone out there to defend one planet. Nobody answered. They were waiting to see what came after the sentence. She said, it seemed they might be doing something larger. Over the next 3 weeks, 6 more species sent signals. They were careful signals, indirect, phrased to be plausible as innocuous transmissions if intercepted, but clear enough to anyone who knew what to look for. Some of them contained technical data. One contained detailed maps of Dravery patrol routes. Another contained the precise location of the relay network hub that coordinated the collective's logistics grid across 12 star systems. People on Earth who had the job of analyzing such things looked at that last piece of information for a long time and then looked at each other. On the Dravery flagship, Drath sat in his command bay and read reports. The targeting network had been restored. The damaged ships had completed emergency repairs. The fleet was, on paper, ready to resume operations. But Drath had stopped thinking about resuming operations. He was thinking about something else. He was thinking about the number 47. He had spent his career with that number as a source of pride. 47 civilizations brought into the collective without significant resistance, a record of efficient, bloodless expansion that spoke to the reasonableness of the Dravery approach. He had always understood it as evidence that the collective was right about the nature of the universe. That resistance was irrational. That survival meant adaptation, and adaptation meant acceptance. He was beginning to understand that he had misread the number. 47 civilizations had not surrendered because they agreed. They had surrendered because they had each been alone at the moment of decision, facing a fleet they had no context for, without any evidence that refusal was survivable. They had calculated the odds and reached the rational conclusion. He had always thought that meant the resistance was absent. He had never considered that it might simply be waiting. He prepared a second report for High Command. This one was longer than the first. This one contained a recommendation. High Command did not follow it. On the Resolute, repairs were ongoing. The port section would not be fully restored before they returned to Earth, but the ship was stable, and the crew was still doing their jobs with the same intensity they had carried from the moment of launch. Bayo had her rib treated and was back in the engine bay within a day. Dov ran targeting calibrations every morning as though the battle might resume at any moment, because it might, and preparation was the only thing he knew how to give. Okafor read every incoming transmission himself. By the end of the 3rd week, there were 11 species that had made contact. 11 civilizations scattered across a vast stretch of space, all of whom had been silent for years or decades, all of whom had made a decision at the same moment, the moment they saw one ship refuse to move. He wrote a log entry that he did not intend as a speech, and which was later read at every military graduation ceremony on Earth for the next 100 years. He wrote, "We came out here as one ship, carrying one answer to one ultimatum. We may go back as something else entirely. I don't know yet what that is. But I know that the people who sent us that signal, the ones who said we were not alone, who said they had been waiting, I know they were not talking about ships. They were talking about a decision. We made one, and it turned out the whole galaxy was watching. 6 months is not a long time. In the history of a species, 6 months is nothing, not even a breath. But in 6 months, Earth built 7 ships. They were not beautiful. They were not the product of decades of careful engineering and testing. They were vessels assembled in a hurry by a species that had decided it needed them immediately, built in orbital yards running double shifts around the clock, crewed by people who trained while the ships were still being welded together. They were rough and new, and they had problems. Every one of them had problems, but they moved through space, and they were armed, and they carried human beings who knew exactly why they were there. They were joined by 4 ships from the Titian, 2 from a species called the Merrick, quiet, deliberate people whose home world had been absorbed 30 years ago, and who had been building ships in secret for the last 9, and 1 ship from a species whose name had no translation yet, who had simply shown up at the coordinates provided in their signal and waited, patient and enormous, until the humans arrived. 14 ships in total. Against the Dravery Collective, with its thousands of warships and centuries of dominance, 14 ships was not an army. It was a statement. The Resolute led the formation. It had been repaired. The port section was new metal, slightly different in color from the rest of the hull, a seam that would never be invisible. Bayo had not tried to make it invisible. She had said, plainly, that the ship wore what it had been through, and there was no reason to pretend otherwise. Okafor stood on the bridge of a ship that had been built to study stars and repurposed to fight for a world, and he looked at the formation on the display screen, the 14 ships holding position at the boundary of collective space, and he felt something that was not pride exactly, because pride implies that you expected this, and he had not expected any of it. He felt something closer to gratitude, which surprised him. Ambassador Riva's ship was on his starboard side. She had come herself rather than sending a representative. He had asked her why, through Anika's translation, in a brief exchange before the fleet held position. She had said that she had been alive when the collective came for her world. She had been young and had watched the elders debate and calculate and conclude that there was no choice. She had believed them. She had spent 40 years believing them. She wanted to be present for this. She said, whatever this turned out to be. He understood that. The Dravery had responded to the formation's arrival with a fleet of their own, not 12 ships this time. 60. They had sent 60 warships to the boundary, because 60 was the kind of number that ended conversations. They held their position and made no immediate move, because High Command was watching the situation more carefully now. Drath's report had been disregarded, but the data that supported it had not. Somewhere in collective leadership, a person with enough authority to matter had read the analysis and understood, at least partially, what they were looking at. The channel opened. It was not Drath this time. He had been reassigned. The voice that came through belonged to a senior member of Collective High Command, a level of authority that had never once personally communicated with a target species. That, by itself, was a change. The High Commander spoke for some time. The speech was formal and measured. It outlined the Collective's history, its rationale for expansion, the efficiency and stability of its system of governance. It made the case for compliance in terms that were almost philosophical, the benefits of coordination, the waste of conflict, the mathematical certainty of the outcome if the current situation continued to escalate. It was, Okafor thought, a very good speech. He had not expected a very good speech. He waited until it was done. Then he opened his own channel. He said that Earth did not want war. He said it clearly and without any decoration, because it was true. He said that Earth did not want to conquer anything. He said that humanity had enough difficulty managing its own affairs without taking on responsibility for anyone else's, and anyone who had been paying attention to human history could confirm that. A few people on the bridge heard that, and very nearly smiled. He said that Earth would defend itself. He said that every species that had reached out to them, every civilization that had been absorbed without being asked, every world that wanted something other than the future the collective had assigned to it, Earth would stand with them, for as long as it had ships and people willing to crew those ships. He said that was not a threat. It was simply a description of what humanity had already decided to be. He said that the offer to negotiate a genuine peace, with genuine terms, was real. He said it would not be repeated. Then he closed the channel. The bridge of the Resolute was quiet. Not the anxious quiet of people waiting for permission to breathe, a different kind. The quiet of people who had just watched something done the right way and knew it. Dav looked at his instruments. He did not reach for his controls. He looked at Sarai, and she looked back at him, and they held that for a moment without words. Riva's ship held its position beside them, through the hull of her vessel. If you had been able to see her, she was sitting in her own command chair, watching the Dravery fleet on her screen, and she was feeling something she had not felt in 40 years. She did not have a word for it in her own language. She had borrowed the human one. She had been practicing it quietly, alone, for 3 days. The word was hope. The Dravery fleet did not move. Neither did the 14 ships. The two formations held their positions in the silence of space, and the universe waited to see what came next. What came next would take time. There would be negotiations and failures, and more confrontations, and moments where everything nearly broke and had to be pulled back together with effort and stubbornness and the specific human refusal to accept that anything was truly finished. History does not resolve cleanly. It continues. But in that moment, on the bridge of a scarred and patched exploration vessel at the edge of collective space, what existed was this. A species that had been told to surrender had sent a warship instead and was still standing. The galaxy had been warned that Earth would fall quietly, the way 47 civilizations had fallen before it. Instead, it had stayed. It had brought its ships. It had brought its allies. It had brought the same decision it had been making since the signal came through. The decision that some things mattered more than the math. Now the galaxy would have to decide what to do with a species that simply did not know how to stop.